Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Captain Patriotic. How's everybody doing? Merry Christmas, everyone, and I hope you get to spend some quality time with your friends and family during this holiday season. Now, if you'll recall in my last video, I wrapped up my series on the most decorated veterans to serve during the Korean War of 1950 through 1953. And if you'll recall in the last video, I picked the most decorated U.S. Marine veteran to serve during the Korean War, which went to none other than General Ray Davis. Now, I highly encourage you to go back and watch that previous video because his story really is fascinating. He has over 30 years of service with the U.S. Marine Corps, serving in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, including the action during the Korean War that earned him the Congressional Medal of Honor during the famous Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. Like I said, if you want to read and hear about a fascinating story, I highly recommend you go check out his story in this last video. So today, in honor of the Korean War and a special individual that I want to talk about today, I thought it would be very interesting to talk about the most decorated combat veteran for the state of Alaska. Now, for those of you that may or may not be familiar, I had the honor and privilege to go on an Alaskan cruise and a 2-week excursion to Alaska with my family, and let me tell you guys, that was probably one of, if not the best trip that I have been on in my life. I mean, the food is wonderful, and the wildlife is just incredible, whether it's whales out on the coast and in the ocean, to the bears and the reindeer and other wildlife in Denali National Park, to the pure scenery with the mountains and all of the forest greenery, whether it's from Anchorage all the way up to Fairbanks where Denali is. I can't say enough great things about it, y'all. I mean, it is very well worth a visit, and we had an absolute wonderful time. I highly, highly recommend that if you have an opportunity to, please go up and visit at least some of Alaska. After being there with my family a few months ago, it honestly is in my top 5 favorite states to visit just from the pure scenery and history alone. Highly, highly recommend it. So, in honor of Alaska, I thought it would be amazing to talk about the last frontier's most decorated war veteran, which happens to be a Korean War veteran himself. And that particular honor goes to Marine Corps veteran Archie Van Winkle, who was a U.S. Marine combat veteran who was ultimately awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions as a Marine Staff Sergeant, leading a charge with other Marines during the advance to the Chosin Reservoir in late 1950. Now, before his greatest achievement in Korea, Van Winkle was a combat veteran of World War II with experience in the Pacific Theater, where he initially left the service after World War II ended, but then rejoined between World War II and Korea. And it was after hostilities broke out in Korea in June of 1950 that he was recalled to active duty service, before being basically medically inactive in July of 1951 due to injuries he had sustained with that Medal of Honor action. But that wasn't the end of his story, though, as we will see shortly. Van Winkle decided to make a career out of the Marines and again returned to active duty service after he recovered, where he again would serve in combat during the Vietnam War. Now, it goes without saying, and as of right now, Van Winkle is considered the only Medal of Honor recipient from the state of Alaska, which is a high achievement in itself. To give you just a little bit of background history, Alaska was one of the last two states to join the Union, and it actually didn't become a state until 1959. But ironically, Alaska was considered a U.S. territory for almost 100 years before it gained statehood. In fact, there was a lot of gold miners that went up there in the late 1800s to discover gold. And ironically, Alaska served as a good base for U.S. forces during World War II to combat the Japanese. But anyway, I highly encourage you to look up the history of Alaska. It's quite fascinating, you guys. There's actually a lot more there than what meets the eye. So back to Van Winkle. Archie Van Winkle, our main character in this story, was born on March 17th, 1925 in Juneau, Alaska, to Dutch parents. It hasn't been confirmed, but from what I understand, he was born in Alaska, but his family didn't live there very long because when he was little, him and his whole family actually moved down south to Washington, where he attended public schools in Darrington, Washington. He was actually a very talented athlete because it was said that he captained both the boxing and the football teams at Darrington High School, where he also played baseball as well as basketball. Now, after he graduates from high school early in 1942, he entered the University of Washington in Seattle in order to study physical education, probably from all the sports that he was involved in high school. But after enrolling there in August of 1942, he actually left after only 4 months of school in order to enlist in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserves on December 14th, 1942. Now, during the almost next 3 years of service in the Marines, he served as an aviation radio man, sometimes an aerial gunner, and a mechanic, where he participated in the Solomon Islands campaign, the Philippine campaign of late 1944 and early 1945, as well as the New Guinea campaign. Those of you that are not familiar, technically all military branches have their air section of the service, including the Army, the Marines, and the U.S. Navy. Now, you got to imagine, you're basically a late teens, early 20s kid in one of these bomber planes in World War II, and you are assigned to be a radio man, basically to tell the other planes in the squadron that the enemy planes are coming or where they're coming from. And even though you're not ground infantry, being an aerial gunner at this time, regardless of military branch, is honestly one of the most dangerous jobs that anybody could do in the U.S. military at this time. Because if an enemy airplane spots somebody on one of those bomber planes or whatever plane they were flying shooting at them, guess what? You're going to be the first thing that enemy is going to be shooting at, so you're almost guaranteed to die, or it's a very high probability you could get injured or killed doing this. Anyway, he volunteered to do that willingly, and he is actually pretty damn good at it too. Now, because of injuries that he sustained on one of his last missions during the war, he was basically medically evacuated from the Pacific Theater, and on October 22nd, 1945, he was honorably discharged from the Marines. Now, for his service in World War II, he was actually a very highly decorated Marine at that time, even for being a Marine aviator. He was ironically awarded 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, which is the highest honor that anybody can receive while participating in an aerial flight, regardless of military branch, only behind the Medal of Honor and the Service Crosses. He also received an Air Medal with Valor Device for his bravery, as well as a Purple Heart Medal for his role as a Marine aviator. In addition to these medals, he was also awarded the World War II Victory Medal, the American Campaign Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, as well as the Philippine Liberation Medal. So after being discharged from the Marines in 1945, Van Winkle decided to return to Washington State, close to where he used to live with his family, and to continue his studies in physical education at Everett Junior College, which is now considered Everett Community College, for 1 year after that, and then he would transfer to the University of Washington. So he's back as a civilian. He is a combat veteran, and as you can only imagine with a lot of World War II veterans at this time, it was very hard to adjust to civilian life. So he makes the ultimate decision in March of 1948 to rejoin the Marine Corps Reserves, where he became a member of Company A, the 11th Infantry Battalion of the U.S. Marine Corps in Seattle. As a Marine reservist, it was basically like light post-war duty. I mean, the U.S. military at this time basically was cut in half, and they weren't so worried about another war for any time soon. After the Korean War breaks out, the battalion that Van Winkle was a part of was mobilized and ordered to Camp Pendleton in California on August 7th, 1950, for some training to get them prepared to go and ship off to Korea. Later that month, him and the battalion would arrive in Korea just in time for him and his other Marines to participate in the famous Incheon landing in September of 1950. Those of you that may or may not be familiar with this, the Battle of Incheon, or the landing at Incheon, was a pivotal turning point in the Korean War. Basically, that is where U.S. Marines and other UN forces, they landed the beach at Incheon to surprise the communist forces, and eventually, through a bunch of bitter fighting, they would overtake and retake the capital of Seoul from the North Koreans. It was from then on that UN and U.S. forces would push the communist North Koreans back up into North Korea. Anyway, it's a lot of history, but it was a pivotal turning point in the Korean War early on. So here's Van Winkle. He's participating with the different Marine divisions, fighting in these iconic battles. And ironically, for being a Marine aviator in World War II, he learns pretty quickly that he's actually a pretty damn good Marine officer with a ground infantry unit. In fact, there's a bunch of Marines under his command that highly looked up to him, and they would follow him anywhere in combat. He was just as effective on the ground as he was in the air in the previous war. But his greatest achievement was about to happen very soon. And fast forward just a little over a month later to November 2nd, 1950, where Van Winkle at that point had reached the rank of staff sergeant and was continuing to serve as an infantry platoon sergeant with the 3rd Marine Division. Now, it was on that particular night near the town of Sudong, North Korea, during a night skirmish in the advance to the famous Chosin Reservoir, where he led a charge of other Marines through harrowing and weathering enemy fire from the North Koreans. As he was leading this basically bayonet and all-out charge against this fortified hill with machine guns, a bullet grazed and shattered his arm, and after being shot there, he was seriously wounded in the chest by a direct hit from an enemy hand grenade that exploded close by, killing one of his Marines and severely injuring him in the process. Now, although at this point he can barely get up, he can't even get up at all. He is dazed and confused. He has no idea what the heck is going on. He finally comes to, and he refuses, downright refuses any kind of medical evacuation just so he could stay there and encourage and lead his men to victory. Now, he did this for hours on end, I'm telling you. It must have been at least 4, 5, 6 or longer hours, but it was in the middle of the night when all this happened, and he didn't get out of there until the very, very next day. And during all this time, after being refused to be evacuated, he continued to shout orders and encouragement to all the Marines under his command while lying on the ground, weak from all the blood loss. Now, his leadership and downright badass attitude and courage during this time enabled the outnumbered Marine platoon to repulse the North Korean attack that night. And shortly the next morning after the skirmish ended, he nearly collapsed and he was unconscious from all the blood loss. But it was because of those actions that day that he would later learn that he would earn not only 2 Purple Heart medals for the injuries he sustained that night, but also the Congressional Medal of Honor for his selflessness and near sacrifice of his life under bitter conditions. After that battle concluded and he was finally taken to a MASH unit, or a Mobile Army Surgical Hospital unit close by for severe medical treatment and surgery, Van Winkle would be evacuated to Japan and later to the United States, where upon recovery about 2, maybe 3 months later, he subsequently served for several months with the Marine Guards at the naval base in Bremerton, Washington. And because he was still having some trouble from his injuries and everything, he was released from active duty in the Marines on July 16th, 1951. But he was still attached to the 10th Infantry Battalion of the Marine Corps Reserves in Seattle, Washington. Now, even though he was put on the inactive duty status, I'm sure that was very disappointing for him because he really wanted to get back out in the fight in Korea and serve with his men because he knew that's where, and felt like that's where he belonged. He was actually bitterly disappointed, to say the very least, but he understood. Little did he know that something big was in the works for him, and he was about to receive the greatest recognition of his life. Fast forward to January of 1952, he's still serving stateside in the Marine Reserves, where he gets the official notice from the president that he is to go to a ceremony in Washington, D.C. for a special occasion. Well, at that time, he wasn't sure what he was going to do there, but little did he know he was actually about to be awarded the highest military decoration that any member of the U.S. military can be awarded, the Congressional Medal of Honor, for his harrowing actions that night in November of 1950. About a month later, on February 6, 1952, President Harry Truman would present Van Winkle with the Navy Medal of Honor during a series of ceremonies at the White House. He was more than humbled, to say the very, very least. Now, the following day after being awarded the Medal of Honor, he was sworn in as a second lieutenant in the Marines by General Lamell C. Shepard Jr., who at that time was the official commandant of the Marine Corps. After all this, it was late 1952 before he gained full strength and mobility back from those injuries he sustained in Korea. So it was late 1952, early 1953, whenever he was called back up to active duty status. And his next assignment after being recalled up was to attend the basic school at the Marine Corps School in Guanaco, Virginia, from November 1952 all the way until May of 1953. Once there, First Lieutenant Van Winkle completed Air Observation School at Guanaco in November and was assigned as an air observer with the 3rd Marine Division at Camp Pendleton, and would later serve as a company executive officer and company commander with the 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines of the 3rd Marine Division. And it was during that time that he was promoted to captain on December 31st, 1954. In 1955, he would be assigned as regimental liaison officer with the 9th Marines. Now, at the end of that year, November 1955 until April of 1958, he served as assistant officer in charge of the Marine Corps recruiting station in Indianapolis, Indiana. And a month later, in May of 1959, he was named commanding officer of the Marine Detachment aboard the USS Newport News. He finally received his Bachelor of Arts degree in history in June of 1961. So, after receiving his bachelor's in June of 1961, he transfers to Hawaii, where he was assigned as the company commander of the 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, 4th Marines of the 1st Marine Brigade, and in April of 1962, he became director of the 1st Marine Brigade Schools and was credited with helping establish the Brigade Guerrilla Warfare School, which basically was the precursor to Marine Special Forces School that Marine operatives go to this very day. Fast forward about a couple of years to June of 1964, and Van Winkle reported to the Air Command and Staff College at the Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. Now, upon graduation from this program in June of 1965, he was assigned duty as manpower analyst and later head of the Operating Forces Section, Manpower Control Branch, G1 Division at the Marine Corps Headquarters. And it was while serving in this capacity for the next couple of years that he would ultimately be promoted to Lieutenant Colonel on July 1st, 1967. So at this point in time, for the last 15 years or so, his service in the Marines has mostly been stateside duty after being awarded the Medal of Honor in 1952. Now, the main reason I suspect that this was happening was because after World War II, Congress passed an act to where any Medal of Honor recipients that are still in the military after that action, they basically were trying to do anything and everything to keep them out of harm's way from being killed or whatever, because that has happened before. And I kind of suspect that's what they did with him and why he stayed out of the infantry unit for so long. But his luck would run out very shortly, though, because his next assignment was to go back to South Vietnam about 5 years later, compared to when he first went there in 1962. His second tour of duty in Vietnam was actually more dangerous and more eventful than his first tour of duty because, as you'll recall, basically that first tour of duty in 1962, he acted more as one of the early advisors to the South Vietnamese, more so than an actual combat officer, to say the least. In fact, he would actually be decorated on a couple occasions for bravery and valor in combat with his Marines. He actually earned his first Bronze Star Medal in January of 1968 during the infamous Tet Offensive. where the North Vietnamese basically launched a surprise attack across various different U.S. and South Vietnamese bases across South Vietnam during the Tet Offensive, or the Lunar New Year for the Vietnamese people. He did that during the Battle of Hue, where he was commanding his small battalion of Marines during the advance of the city. Now, fast forward about 6 months later, he would be awarded a second Bronze Star Medal on July 6th, 1968. And this time, it was during the famous Marine Battle of Chosin. And Chosin was the Marine base where it was being overran by North Vietnamese and Communist forces. And he was awarded that Bronze Star for his actions of basically commanding and leading a battalion of Marines during an assault against North Vietnamese on Hill 689. Now, in addition to his 2 Bronze Star medals, he was also awarded 2 Vietnamese Gallantry Crosses for bravery and service during the conflict. Now, because of his bravery at the Battle of Chosin, he became the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion of the 1st Marines from July of 1968 until the end of his tour of duty in September of 1968. After he returned to the U.S., he was again assigned to the G1 Division of the Marine Corps headquarters in Washington, but this time he served as the head of the Standards and Utilization section of the Manpower Control Branch. He then would go on to serve as a Provost Marshal at Camp Pendleton, California, then as a Provost Marshal General of the Marine Corps, before officially retiring from military service in February of 1974. Wow, you guys, that is a lot to unpack, but he was definitely a very colorful character, to say the very least. He had a very astonishing career in the Marines, starting with World War II and lasting all the way almost to the end of the Vietnam War. Wow, that's over 30 years of service in the Marines. That is crazy, crazy. But I see why a lot of people looked up to him, especially in his home state of Alaska. That is like really, really encouraging. So, as a brief recap to what we just talked about, he started out in the Marine Reserves after the U.S. entered World War II, where he served as a Marine aviator, with his role being different things from being a radio man on a Marine bomber to being an airplane mechanic and sometimes being an aerial gunner on those particular planes before World War II ended. Now, between World War II and Korea, he would re-enlist and would ultimately trade in his wings for an infantryman position as a Marine officer during Korea and Vietnam. Now, as far as the medals that he was awarded for his over 30 years of service in the Marine Corps, Archie Van Winkle was awarded the Navy Medal of Honor, 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 2 Bronze Star Medals, an Air Medal with V device, 3 Purple Heart Medals, a Navy Presidential Unit Citation, as well as 2 Navy Commendation Medals. In addition to his personal decorations for valor in the Marine Corps, his other campaign medals included the American Campaign Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, the World War II Victory Medal, 2 National Defense Service Medals, the Korean Service Medal, an Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal, the Vietnam Service Medal, 2 Vietnam Gallantry Crosses, a Korean Presidential Unit Citation, the Philippine Liberation Medal, the United Nations Korean Medal, And finally, the Vietnam Campaign Medal. Yeah, I would say he more than deserves the title of Alaska's most decorated war veteran, to say the least. So, after retiring from the Marine Corps in 1974, Van Winkle lived a quiet life just off the shore of Ketchikan, Alaska, which is in the southern tip of the state, probably one of the more southernmost Alaskan cities to the mainland U.S. He had an untimely death when he suddenly passed away from natural causes on May 22nd, 1986. His death shocked not only the nation, but his home state of Alaska, because at that point he was a big celebrity in all of Alaska. Like, everybody knew who he was and how respected he was. It was a big, big ordeal, you guys. Now, instead of being interned, let's say, the Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C., he chose to be cremated instead and have his ashes spread at sea in the Tongass Narrows, which the city of Ketchikan, Alaska sits on. He wanted to be one with nature because he loved being in his home state and he loved being on the water so much. Now, about a decade after his ashes were spread, a memorial headstone was placed in the Sitka National Cemetery in Alaska that we can go visit to this day. On October 1st, 1997, a granite monument in Juneau, Alaska, Alaska's capital, was dedicated memorializing Archie Van Winkle as the state's only Medal of Honor recipient. Man, you guys, that was a very inspirational story, and I'm just moved by how talented this man was, from starting out basically as an aviator to being a ground infantry officer. That is very, very interesting, you guys. And I hope you found some interesting history and inspiration from his story. I appreciate everybody tuning in as always. I know some of these videos can be a little much, but I always love history like this, and I hope you appreciate it too. But certainly stick around for next time, and please don't forget to like and subscribe, everybody. Happy holidays, and see y'all next time.